All right, welcome back. Hey, I'm here with Chris Hare, co-founder and joint CEO of EQ8. Chris, did I get the pronunciation of the company name correct?
Well, it's great you asked that. A lot of most people call it EQ8. We're happy with that. We designed it to be equate to bring supply and
Ah,
demand to equivalence, but EQ8 works just fine.
and and you are just an interesting tidbit that you just shared. You're from Texas, but you've been in Australia the past 16 years, give or take. So
Long enough to shape
and
this
you're there now.
accent. Yeah, long enough to shape this accent. So people may
Wow.
see as we
Well,
go through the presentation and try to pick up my little Texanisms, but they're rare.
well, hey, I'll get out of your way for the time being. I understand you're going to be presenting for 20 or so minutes, and then we'll have a discussion after. Sound good?
That sounds great to me. So thank you for those of you who've joined us, and thank you a lot, Al and PAFOW, for having us on. We really, really appreciate it. So Equate has built the only really end-to-end strategic workforce planning software as a service solution. And really, Equate is focused on accelerating achievement by connecting people to organization purpose. And today we're going to be talking about that purpose, which has significant business impact. Sure, we're talking about profit. We're talking about organizations' ability to realize their major milestones. But really, we're talking about capacity. And for profitable businesses or for profit businesses, we're talking about sales. And are we able to achieve our sales targets over multiple years? Or if we're talking about not for profits, can we achieve our mandate? How do we avoid the short term decisions that destroy long term value by connecting to people? Which people are needed and why? And then knowing that, how do we create the action plan that de-risks the realization of our strategy? And this is such an interesting topic, particularly in the year that we've had. How do we navigate the uncertainty that's occurred and use business and workforce scenario planning to figure out what emergence looks like? So let's just talk a little bit or display a little bit about what happens if things go wrong.
But I keep telling you, I'm not a pilot.
And I keep telling you, you flyboys crack me up!
Hi, I'm Alan. I'm your co-pilot.
As a change of pace, I'm going to let you do most of the work. I think you're ready for it, Alan. And I'll just get us started.
We'll need that to live.
Now we can see from that illustration that airline's ability to serve its customer is fundamentally broken. Pilots do cost a lot, and we think often when we're talking, particularly to our friends in finance, about the workforce in terms of a cost. But it's really, pilots are core to the value proposition of that airline. So now that the immediate initial panic around COVID has passed, how is your leadership team thinking about emerging from this period? We feel that you really have to push your leaders on purpose. What are we trying to achieve and how will we achieve it? And it's only by driving that conversation that you can think about long-term viability. Get beyond just surviving this period of time, but get to how will we thrive in the future. And the workforce is your key execution vehicle. It really is the how you will emerge. Now, shocks are nothing new. And certainly the future right now has some uncertainty to it. But if we look at the past, we can see that different patterns of emergence occur through different shocks. Now, speaking of that airline example I just took you through, my co-founder, Alicia Roach, who some of you may have heard of, worked at Qantas during the early 2000s. The airline was having to forecast what amount of pilots and other supporting workforce do we need as we are ordering large aircraft orders, going through 9/11, the war in Iraq, SARS, bird flu. The approach of using dynamic scenarios was critical in helping them reassess the future as each of these shocks kind of came through. And you can use the models, which I'm about to take you through, to figure out what is that line in the sand for what we think the future will look like. And then as things change, how do we redraw that line? Now here we're looking at the 2008 GFC and simply showing the different countries encountered a different type of recovery through that period. And if we look at just the US experiencing different kinds of shocks, we can see that there's different trajectories of what the future looked like in those different instances. And we know that the workforce is impacted by all of these different occurrences. And these charts here show what happens to unemployment through a few different types of shocks. Organizations are comprised of their workforce. And again, the workforce is the execution vehicle, both for how will we emerge and how will we continue to deliver on our value proposition. Now, even before COVID, organizations were facing significant change through digitization and transformation. And just in that previous session, we heard the speakers talk about how some of those things are actually accelerating as companies try to seek efficiencies. But very few companies that we speak with are confident that they have the right workforce that they need now. And virtually zero companies can say, we know what workforce we need in 3 years' time or 5 years' time. If we don't know that, how are we going to make the right decisions now that don't impact our ability to hit the right trajectory coming out of this pandemic? And it continues to be a very noisy time. We see lots of data and information coming through, but it's often difficult to figure out what decisions should you make from this data. And our leaders do not really have a shared vision, yet they're making very big decisions on who to keep and which programs are going to matter now. But we don't want to make a mistake. We don't want to cut a program that costs money right now because it's delivering value in 2 years and we're not sure exactly what that is. We end up 2 years from now having a shortfall in our workforce. We don't have the capacity to serve customer adequately and we damage our brand. We really need to learn from Homer. Don't wait and react. Think ahead, look forward. Otherwise, you will be destroying customer value. So how do we do that? We use dynamic scenario planning. We're sitting here in React and a little bit of Restart, and there's multiple different potential trajectories that our organizations can go on. We need to think about that. Now, as Alicia often says, and you would have heard this before, all models are wrong. Some are useful. Really what we're talking about here is the fact that leaders need a structured conversation. They need to get aligned on purpose. A broad vision is not enough. We need to really think in a nuanced way, what will our trajectory look like? Dynamic scenario planning creates a sandbox for you connecting your people to that purpose. Now, sometimes we get a bit of discussion from leaders who haven't really engaged in this kind of process about a bandwidth issue. And those people are going to be stuck in React for a long period of time. And they're really missing a trick in thinking, how can we look forward and plan where we need to get? If we're stuck in React, there's every chance that other organizations are going to leap ahead of us and really steal our customers. So how do we do this? Let me take you through a little bit of the building blocks that drive dynamic scenario planning. I spoke a little bit at the beginning that equate really stands for bringing this concept of demand and supply into equivalence. So let me talk a little bit about demand. I've got a role here, customer service agents. We're all familiar. I'm going to use this as an example But this example equally applies to specialized roles like pilots or AI machine learning specialists, uh, 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 even certain white-collar professional roles. Any of this kind of concept will apply broadly. So when we're looking at customer service agents, we might gather some future of work data that says over the future, due to technology, we'll need some amount less. Let's say for this data set, we've got 55% of CSAs being displaced due to technology over a future time horizon. And that's great to know, but what does that mean your organization should do? You really need your context. You need your purpose. We need to define this thing called demand. What do we need over the future? And we define demand by looking at activity drivers, thinking about transformation. And what we might do is project for your organization a demand curve that looks like this. Yes, we are able to display some of our workers or some of what they're doing through technology, but we need to plan for that transformation, launch the project, and it will hit in the future, and it will reduce our demand by 20%. Our customer value proposition may mean that we still want to have some interaction, and so we're not going to fully displace those CSAs. And that's really important to know. We also need to know that now that we've brought in this technology, we're going to have people that have reams of data to analyze. We're going to have things that we need to do to tweak that technology. And so there's new capabilities that we're going to require. And in fact, by freeing up some of the CSA workload through technology, we actually want the existing CSAs to have some increase in what they do. We want them to have higher quality conversations with our customers, for instance. And that demand picture is really important. Let's just consider now supply. So this should be quite familiar to everyone on the call. We're going to calculate turnover for that supply, and we're going to say, over time, we usually see about a quarter of the CSAs leave every year. Now, we might put ourselves on automatic and just rehire those roles as they leave. But when we bring back in our demand picture, we see a problem. That works for a period of time, but then once this channel shift comes in, we're ending up carrying way too many. We've got an oversupply. And it should be clear to people on the call that oversupply means that we're carrying a cost we don't need. We're reducing our profitability, or again, for not-for-profits, our sustainability of our model. Now, other organizations, and we've seen a lot of this through the pandemic, will hit a hiring freeze, or as one of our US customers says, a hiring frost. And they'll just let supply dwindle. And that's okay, again, for a period of time. But at some stage, we end up with an undersupply. And that is really a bigger problem. Again, we're talking about the inability to deliver on our purpose. We're leaving customers who want to deal with us unable to, or we're not dealing with them in the way in which we'll keep them happy. So we have a lot of brand damage, and we're unable to bring those folk back very easily. Or again, if we're in the not-for-profit space, we're not able to really fulfill our mandate. So we really need to see this picture for all roles. And once we do have that picture, we can then create scenarios. So here I've got an example of looking around an airline, a sample airline across 4 roles, and saying that green line is a forecast of demand in a normal trajectory. And then what we've done is we've mapped that normal trajectory against the shock that we've encountered in B, C, and D on your screens. And B, C, and D show that there's different potential trajectories across this organization. And we really need to work with leaders and figure out which one applies, because depending on which scenario is actually pertinent, we're going to do much different things. So we really need to use this to get leaders into a structured conversation where they discuss, debate, really agree what is it that we're planning for and what should we do. And we find that using models where you can adjust the assumptions underneath these trajectories and ask different folks to debate activity drivers and business related issues really forces a higher level of engagement. By having numbers that aren't static and necessarily signed up to in a budget sense, but more played with in this sandbox, you get a higher level of engagement. And what we find is most organizations have not considered their strategies in this degree of granularity. We're not getting down to a rostering level of information, but we're getting enough where we really need to break down the elements of a value chain across an organization and then forecast those elements. Most organizations have not gone to that level of detail in their strategies, and everybody can just kind of nod their heads and accept that that is the strategy for the company, but they're interpreting it differently in terms of what it means for them. Now, if we drill down into two segments of that workforce, we can see, in fact, there's different possible futures within those workforces. And this insight has a major impact on the organization. This causes us to really think about different strategies and what the trade-offs may be in any given strategy for a different workforce segment. It really helps us think about what are the right programs and how do we deploy them to de-risk these different elements of our workforce. This is really around what are the right buy, build, borrow decisions that we need to make for check-in staff versus pilots. And you can see here that for check-in staff, there is always an expectation that the demand for that staff would decline. We would use technology and we would bring in items that would help us lower our usage of that specific workforce and maybe get them to do other things or redeploy them or exit them out of the business. And these different trajectories show us different ways in which that might occur. Whereas for pilots, we actually saw an increase. But then with the shock, there's a question mark about how long will their decrease last, and therefore, what should we do with them? Now, if we move this to a broader level and think, what are all the different potential trajectories? We've put on this slide a few. There's other potential futures for sure. But for those of you on this call, if you think about within your own organization, you have different roles. What are the top 2 or 3 most critical roles in your organization right now? And which of these trajectories fit? I imagine that there could be debate on which trajectory makes the most sense. And I also imagine that the segments that you picked may have different trajectories. But if you're not looking forward and forecasting and thinking about this longer term viability question, how are you sure that what you're spending money on right now and where you're investing your time and programs are actually correct? Because the world has changed. The bell can't be unrung. We're living right now in one of the largest social experiments of our lifetime. And it's all been changing. The who, what, when, where, how of how we work has changed. And even, in fact, a lot of the why. So the workforce, we all know, is key to the capability of the organization and its capacity. And that's make or break for our brands. If we don't get this right, we're going to have Homer levels of damage to the organization. And the cost of not kind of getting this right is large. If we don't know where we're going and we make the wrong short-term decisions that hurt our long-term viability, we're going to alienate customers, but we're also going to disengage employees. What we really want to be able to do is have that nuanced conversation with leadership using dynamic scenarios to drive a real clarity on where we're going so that we can have honest conversations with our employees. How can we talk to employees about capability build or their careers if we don't even know what we need in 2 or 3 years? If we do, again, we can have that honest conversation of these are the elements of the workforce that we'll no longer be doing in 18 months or 2 or 3 years' time. Let's have a discussion with the individuals that are in those roles and let them know that and talk about what's the right value share between here and there. How do you help us as an organization do what we need to do, knowing that there will be a sunset in our relationship? Or even better, where we see most organizations going, let's decide what are the capabilities that we need of the future. Let's figure out which employees have some portion of those capabilities, and let's help them get the rest of what they need to help us meet our demand. And at the same time, we're helping those employees build their skills in a very targeted commercial way in a period of uncertainty. And what could help our employee value propositions more than that? So thank you for listening to me kind of speak on this topic. I'm definitely happy to take questions and have a bit of discussion around this area. But I hope you've seen a little bit of a snapshot of how you use dynamic scenario planning to navigate this kind of period of uncertainty and reemerge stronger and better. We need to really get clear on our purpose, what we're trying to do, and how we'll do it. We need to drive that joint conversation across leadership using scenario planning. We really have to help the organization look forward so that it can achieve by connecting its people to its purpose. Thank you.
Yeah, Chris, that was fantastic. And I not only from a kind of a clear narrative. And I have to be careful because I think everyone who contributes is contributing their unique value, and it's all fantastic. What I want to call out is that I have long been a fan of scenario planning. I grew up professionally at Ernst & Young in the energy industry, and so we. It was the Cambridge Energy Research Associates,
Right.
Daniel Yergin, and others were doing scenario planning around energy. And the scenario plannings were 10, 15 years out. And there's still a role to play. But the discipline was like right there. And as I have entered the workforce or HR world, I had been taken aback by how little scenario planning was done. And the pushback was consistently, we didn't have the data. It was too esoteric. And now we do have the data and we have the tools to aggregate and analyze and make it consumable. That's what I heard you talk about. So my pointed question, and one that's come up already today, is arguably organizations don't have decision-making processes or decision-making bodies that are adequate to consume all this and use it appropriately. Are you finding that, and are you coaching leaders and others to, hey, this is the optimal use case? This is how you might want to shift and move to really reduce risk and increase the likelihood that your investments and decisions reap the desired return. What does that look like for you?
I think you've nailed it. I think I feel like I spend most of my day around kind of coaching around this space and really encouraging this kind of discipline, which feels so new to HR, but as you've astutely pointed out, is not new in the business world. But what I do find is new, even for our business leaders, is they haven't applied dynamic scenario to the workforce. So HR hasn't done it, and neither have they. They've left that as an assumed. And I think what I find with even large companies, we're doing work with a Fortune 100 right now, and they have some very smart people in there. They're uncomfortable as we're kind of heading towards this scenario workshop phase, and they're going, how do we take these discussions and the data that we've got and spin that into possible futures? And it's uncomfortable for people, their first kind of go around. I think what's really important to help crystallize this in leaders' heads is ask them, do you know that you have the right workforce today? And then ask, do you know what the workforce should be? And when they say that they don't, that's a huge gap. And I think most of our business leaders can see that their ability to execute the program is going to be through people. And the fact that they can't answer that question is a heavy indictment. And then you open up this kind of territory of how can we credibly answer this question? How can we build some kind of a model? And as you know, the models that you would have been using in the energy sector were had assumptions in them. And we need to rely on some of the great data we have, but also some of the wonderful strategic thinking that's sitting in people's heads but isn't captured anywhere. Let's capture it. And then what we're doing really is denominating it in a common currency, and that currency is people.
Yeah. Yeah, I like it. I just got to chill. I'm wearing a jacket. I got to chill. It's because you're absolutely right. I think there's some room, and nature of this event today is that we need a better language in which to talk about this sometimes enormous esoteric challenge. However, it is now more palatable. It is something that, to your point, you use the word indictment, and that's kind of a trigger word in the United States, as you well know. But it is. I would put forth that as at this day and age, it is irresponsible to lead an organization without leveraging such insights. And so, I mean, what are your thoughts on that comment? And how do we shift things?
I think you've hit probably the most important aspect of this on the head. This idea of how can you run a large organization made up of people and you're just in react mode. There's this kind of lack of social responsibility that's inherent in that in this day and age. I think, those of us who've been in the workforce for a few decades can remember when restructures would happen every 2 or 3 years. Enough pressure would build up in the system and the leaders we had, and we go, okay, time to change the dynamic. Companies could restructure every 3 to 6 months now easily. And it's because they're waiting until these pressures build up and then they quickly react and you can't do that. You can't live that way. You end up giving employees zero certainty. They're watching the people sitting in the desk next to them here one day, gone the next, and then you're asking them to care about the organization. If you can't shift your thinking a bit and look forward, you can't possibly know which people you need, who's critical to your future, what you're going to do with them. How are you possibly having those honest kind of conversations with your employee base of where we're going? And how do you, we spend so much money on leadership training and investing in employee kind of culture to do things like this in the pandemic and just lurch from decision to decision. How do we ask people to come back and care about our organizations? And look, we're not asking for perfection. No one's going to look at the future and get it 100% right. But let's at least look at the future and constantly be able to adjust and be able to say, as of what we know today, the next 2 or 3 years, this is our trajectory. And for you in these roles, this is where we need you to move to stay a part of that trajectory.
Yeah. I'm glad you're saying that, because I've seen many, just to your point, just kind of laissez-faire. We'll figure it out. I haven't done that in the 30 years I've been in HR, therefore I don't need to do it now. And that freaks me out when I hear it. And not only do I hear it, it's like the behaviors are evidence of that, and that cannot persist. So my question to you is, there are many doors in which to enter a large enterprise to have this discussion. Talent acquisition, internal mobility, location strategy, all these things, strategy itself. What's your door, or is it all the above? I mean, but what is your maybe hope for the next year? Who do you want to be talking to?
Such a great question. So while I feel that we have great conversations with probably a third of HRDs in the world, I'd say a fraction of those third are actually prepared to do something in this space. And the ones that we find that are prepared to do something in this space have members of their teams that are really strong on capability and future of work and planning. I mean, obviously, we love organizations that have gone very forward on this stuff and brought in strategic workforce planning heads. But really, the kind of folk that sit in this organization that are doing people insights, we really see this as a fourth dimensional view around those people insights, getting a lot of that great data and historical insight and information about who we have right now in supply, and then bringing that fourth dimension of forward time and some of that future work insight. People insight folks who have experienced some of these stress points that we've been talking about around capacity and the lack of conversation and insight into where we actually steering the ship, are really good at helping convince the HRDs to take this plunge. What we find is this kind of work doesn't sit in HR, it's sponsored by HR. But HR is the custodian of the workforce, and they're the ones that can really drive the conversation. But you need leaders who want to engage and get clarity on where they're going.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that you said that, because I used the word facilitator. Many talk about, oh, we own this. This is our project. This is our initiative. I'm like, oh, yeah. Particularly within HR, you are stewards, to your point. You are facilitators of a process, and you're bringing your expertise, you're bringing the data, you're bringing the tools. And so we haven't had that that education, that experience over the last, since the inception of HR, because the tools haven't existed, the data haven't existed in many cases, and now that the tools and the data are present, what's the appropriate response? And that's where and sounds like you too are jumping up and down. It's like, hey, come on, guys.
It's the world moving too fast. It's, you've seen all the data showing the speed of technology change versus the speed of org change. And look, the part of this, the building block, I kind of touched on this around demand. This has to be a joint exercise. We say that strategic workforce planning, which kind of overlays dynamic scenarios, there's three things we're trying to solve with that. Forecasting the amount of the workforce, determining this kind of action plan, what we're going to do, knowing that. But there's this alignment piece, and that structured conversation is almost worth more than the rest of it, because demand is not something that HR just has or can just kind of make up itself. As you know, these elements of demand and what sits across our value proposition, what we think in marketing versus operations versus finance, is much different. So how do we as HR put those elements of the value chain on the table and get leaders to share what's in their heads? Because that forecast demand, it's not sitting in any of their business systems. And I think HR, that's one of the biggest shocks when they enter into this space, is you have to facilitate defining those elements. And maybe less than half of them have any kind of multi-year forecast. Because you're using sliders and a model, you can force people to have a joint conversation on what those look like. But not only do they not have a workforce forecast, they don't really have a business forecast of those activity drivers, and they need to know it. So HR driving that conversation is a whole different space for us to be in.
Well, again, congratulations to what you and Alicia have created. And obviously maybe not others, but I'm a fan of what you're doing, and keep up the great work. And hopefully, we were planning on returning to Sydney this next spring. That's not going to happen. No. However, what we are going to do is hopefully, assuming it's safe to do so, start creating some watch parties on this topic, and certainly want to highlight this session and other things that we do together moving forward, because I think it's really really not only the tool itself, but I think the process that you advocate is very healthy, and it's something that needs to happen. I would view it as imminent. So yeah, good for you.
Thank you, Al.
Any
really
closing comments,
that.
and how can any closing comments, and how can people learn more about eQ8? Sorry, and you?
Well, there's probably that. Thank you for that, and thank you for those comments, Al. You know, I was excited to get to meet you, and really appreciate all that you've invested, kind of in this area, in this discipline that we all care about. And I think curating, particularly these kinds of discussions, and really driving this change. HR can't sit on its hands. We've got to reach out and grab this stuff, and the folk who are sitting in this kind of space are the ones to drive change in HR. To learn more about us, I'd say there's two ways. One, Alicia is much more eloquent than me, and she is our true guru and thought leader in this space. I heavily encourage people, definitely connect with me on LinkedIn, but look at Alicia and look at her articles. She's written some really engaging short articles that are a great way to understand this space better. And then if you find that your interest continues to grow, please feel free to go to our website, equate.ai, and happy for you to register interest, and we can always kind of take you more through our thinking and methodologies.
All right. Well, Chris, you be well. Didn't pick up on the Texas accent at all. It's full Aussie now.
That's right. I recognize nowhere now. I'm a man without a country. But we would love to
man
see
of the
you,
world.
Al. So let us know if you're here. And one of these days, I shall be back on the West Coast. I would love to meet you in person one day.
Well, likewise. All right, sir. Be well.
Take care.
Cheers.